More than 1,000 years ago, deep in the jungle of northern Cambodia, a civilization arose that built the largest and most beautiful temples the world has ever seen. Then mysteriously, they vanished, smothered by the tropical forest. How did they create such beauty in so hostile a place? And why did they abandon these jewels in the jungle? The ruins of this lost civilization are so remote that it wasn't until 1914 that European explorers discovered this temple. Called Bantay Shrai, the Shrine of the Women, this temple was built just over 1,000 years ago by the people who call themselves the Khmers. From their base in Cambodia, they dominated Southeast Asia. They were masters of stone carving, taking the local pink sandstone, carving every inch of it until no space was left undecorated. But Bantay Shrai is one of many temples that the Khmer created. From the 9th to the 14th century, they built hundreds of temples. They constructed giant cities with vast fortified walls and gates with huge, mysterious faces. And the world's largest sacred building, Angkor Wat. The moat at Angkor Wat is as wide as 2 football fields. The outer wall is 2 miles long, and the central shrine is as tall as Notre Dame Cathedral. But the overwhelming impression is one of grace and beauty. Scattered over a site the size of Manhattan are hundreds of jungle-smothered temples, giant enigmatic statues, and huge man-made reservoirs, clearly the center of a vast and lost civilization. This is real Indiana Jones territory. But how could anyone build such temples in dense tropical jungle? The answer lies in one of the most bizarre natural phenomena in the world. It's hard to believe, but every year this immense river, the Mekong, one of the largest rivers in the world, stops flowing south towards the sea, pauses, reverses, and flows north for several months into the heart of Cambodia. This water ends up in this giant lake, the Tonle Sap, which more than quadruples its size for 4 months each year, drowning whole forests of trees in the process. The source for this strange event lies in the Himalayan mountains of Tibet. When the winter snow melts, vast quantities of water rush southward to the sea. But when this deluge hits the shallow delta at the mouth of the Mekong, it can't all escape to the sea, and so the river backs up and the surplus pours into the Tonle Sap Lake. Normally, a modest collection of muddy pools, navigable only by the smallest of boats, it expands into a shallow sea 100 miles long and 30 miles wide, and in places, 50 feet deep. Drowning great forests as it expands, the leaves from the trees provide vast quantities of food and spawning grounds for the lake's teeming fish population. Floating villages on the lake move back and forth, moving miles every year as the lake grows and then shrinks, harvesting the largest crop of freshwater fish in the world. Here, the Khmer Empire founded its capital on the banks of this extraordinary source of food. Just like the river Nile created Egypt, the remarkable Tonle Sap Lake created the glories of ancient Angkor. In this hot tropical land, civilization stands or falls by its use of water. Between the headwaters of the Angkor region and the Tonle Sap, some 40 miles away, the Khmer people created their kingdom. Thankful for these pure mountain streams, they carved gods in the actual river itself. And hundreds of lingams carved on the floor of the stream assured that the water flowing down to the distant temples of Angkor would be blessed. The lingam is a representation of the male phallus. It is an Indian object of veneration, widely worshipped in Indian temples. But why were they carved on the bed of a Cambodian stream some 2,000 miles from their spiritual home? After all, when these were carved some 1,000 years ago, it would have taken many months of extreme hardship and danger to get here from India. It must have been as difficult as going to the moon in our own time. And why are all the shrines of Angkor filled not with local deities, but with the familiar gods of India? The answer can be found in the rhythms of the tropical monsoon. Indian traders had been coming to Southeast Asia for hundreds of years before the first temple was built, following the rhythms of the monsoon winds, which blew their ships from India to Asia. Once there, they had to wait 6 months or so before the wind reversed its direction and blew them home again. So while they settled down to wait for their passage home, they passed on their ideas of religion, art, dance, and architecture to the local population. The Indian influence explains the layout of Angkor Wat. Because it was the home of a god, the temple and the vast entrance and long causeway leading to the central shrine had to be as splendid as possible. The endless corridors provide space for all the minor gods of India also living in the shrine. Unlike a Christian or Muslim holy place, this wasn't a meeting place for the faithful. These final steps leading up to the main shrine would have been barred to almost everyone. No great religious processions walked up here, just devout priests looking to the everyday needs of the god to anoint and clothe it afresh every morning. And so when you reach its heart, the shrine at the very center of Angkor Wat, it is absolutely tiny. Smaller than most people's living room. And unlike Greek or Egyptian ruins, these shrines are still holy places, worshipped every day by thousands of devout Buddhists. The close connection with India explains why Indian mythology dominates Angkor Wat. Endless miles of carvings tell both Hindu and Buddhist myths. Probably the most fascinating of all the stories is the churning of the Sea of Milk, where the gods work together to generate the elixir of life. Gods and demons compete in a cosmic tug of war, using a giant serpent as a rope. Vishnu, in the form of a tortoise, offers his back as a pivot for the churning. As this continued for 1,000 years, the fish and crocodiles underneath the pivot are cut into pieces by the turmoil. But it's all worth it, for one of the side effects of the churning is the creation of Angkor angels, thousands of beautiful female deities called apsaras. Like angels, they lived in the sky, floating gracefully between the water and the clouds, feasting on the celestial elixir. They could change their shape at will and often visited mortals. In Angkor, over 3,000 of these wonderful mythological beings decorate every shrine. And each and every one of them is different. Different hairstyle, different dress, different expression. They catch your eye everywhere. But the apsaras didn't only exist in stone. Girls selected from the whole empire were sent to the palace to be taught the secret movements of these divine dances. This ritual has its origins in southern India, but at the Khmer court, it became the root of all modern classical dance in Southeast Asia. These dancers are one of the very few links we have to this lost civilization. When the first Westerners reached the site, they found that the Cambodians had no records of their past. We think these buildings were once libraries filled with ancient manuscripts. Like these modern Buddhist texts in a Cambodian temple. These holy books, written on strips of palm leaf, are the greatest treasure this Buddhist monastery possesses. They are used to teach the monks and have been carefully preserved through all the modern tragedies of Cambodia. But in a jungle climate, nothing made of palm leaf lasts very long. These texts are some of the oldest in Cambodia, but were created about the same time when the first American troops went into action in the First World War. So they are no help in understanding the glories of ancient Angkor. But one form of record has survived: carved stone inscriptions in Sanskrit, the sacred language of India. Sanskrit was the language of the Hindu gods for whom they built their beautiful temples. Over 1,200 inscriptions have been translated. Many of them were in praise of the kings of Angkor, and they did lay it on a bit thick. One inscription reads, "In all the sciences and all the sports, and in the arts, the languages and writings and dancings and singings and all the rest, he was as clever as if he had been the first inventor of them. And God, in seeing the king, was astonished and said, 'Why did I create a rival for myself in this king?'" Sure, it's flattery, but it is still useful to modern historians. From these ancient words, they built a detailed chronological list of all the Khmer kings and the temples. This is how we know of the beginnings of the great Khmer Empire. Angkor's rise to greatness all began here in 800 AD. Among these sacred streams, an event occurred that would shape the Khmer Empire for the next 500 years. It was from India that the first great king of Angkor got the idea to crown himself not only as king, but as a god king. And if you were a god king, you have to do great things. First, he had to build a temple that was a copy of the home of the Indian gods, Mount Meru. But this wasn't easy. Mount Meru had 5 peaks and was surrounded by an ocean. So god kings constructed temple mountains with 5 towers, faithfully copying the Indian original. And inside the shrines was the symbol of the king's power, a stone lingam, a phallic symbol. The ocean around Mount Meru was mirrored by a moat. So at Angkor Wat, you have a gigantic moat surrounding a temple with 5 distinct towers. In addition to moats, Cambodian god kings built giant reservoirs. This one to the west of Angkor is 5 miles long, 1.5 miles wide, and contains enough water to fill 17,000 Olympic swimming pools. In a bizarre twist of fate, these magnificent achievements of the ancient Khmer world played their part in one of the 20th century's worst crimes. The ancient Khmer civilization built huge temples deep in the jungles of Cambodia, surrounded by huge moats and vast reservoirs. The great French archaeologist Bernard Grolier thought he knew what these reservoirs were for. They were part of a giant rice-growing system. But there is a problem. So far, no archaeological evidence has been found to back the theory. In recent years, water engineers like James Goodman have searched every inch of the reservoir walls looking for clues as to what they were for. He has not found a single ancient outlet from the reservoir into the surrounding fields. It begins to look like this vast area of water was used for something other than growing rice. A recent survey by a NASA satellite using radar imaging has also failed to show channels leading out from the reservoirs into the fields. It is a difficult idea for the late 20th century to grasp. Vast building programs, enormous quantities of water, and no practical use for it whatsoever. The idea that the reservoirs were huge rice-growing schemes may have had its own grisly effect on the modern history of Cambodia. When the Americans finally pulled out of Vietnam in the spring of 1975, the pro-Western government of Cambodia had no chance of surviving. On the morning of April 17th, the Communist Army of Pol Pot moved into the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. Pol Pot grew up near the Great National Museum and knew how glorious the early history of Cambodia had been. He was fond of saying that if the Khmer people could build Angkor, they could do anything. He had read about the great rice-growing success in ancient times and wanted to revive this glorious period of Cambodia's history. The result was one of the worst tragedies in this century of horrors. Within hours of Pol Pot's coup, the people of Phnom Penh and other cities were being told to leave their homes and march out into the country. Without exception, young or old, toddlers or disabled, sick or pregnant, were on their feet. For the next 4 years, the horrors of the killing fields continued, with almost everyone in the country forced to grow rice. Any sign of dissent meant instant death, and maybe as many as 2 million people, a quarter of the total population, perished. It was a tragedy based in part on the mistaken idea that the ancient reservoirs were giant rice-growing machines. But the more specialists examine the reservoirs and temples, the more mysterious they become. James Goodman has been taking precise measurements of the heights of all the ancient buildings.
Okay, 1.365.
This ruin was once an early ancient capital of the Khmer, but was soon abandoned. Why? James thinks he found the answer. The site is too low and would flood badly every few years. What the ancient Khmer kings were looking for was a site near to the expanding and contracting Tonle Sap Lake, but on high enough ground to stay dry even in the wettest of years. The Tonle Sap, not the ancient reservoirs, provides the answer to how the ancient Khmers grew so much rice. As the lake gradually expands and shrinks, the Khmer used the newly exposed wet lake bottom to plant new rice. At Angkor today, you can see rice being harvested in one spot and only a few miles away being planted. It is a system that allows for almost continuous rice production and was almost certainly the economic backbone of Angkor's glorious achievements. So why build reservoirs at such huge cost of men and materials? No practical reason, it seems. It was simply what God kings had to do. And this glorification of the king through gigantic building projects reached its zenith with Angkor Wat, the single most astonishing achievement of the entire Angkor period. Angkor Wat, the greatest of all Khmer temples, was built in the middle of the 12th century, at the same time as Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. As a building, it is as impressive as the Great Pyramids of Egypt, with its vast outer moat, causeway, and giant central towers, and as artistically distinctive as the Taj Mahal. Angkor Wat, the name simply means Temple of the Capital, is a glorious mixture of qualities. Its wide, smooth, grassy exterior is balanced by the sculpted loveliness of its carved interior. Its highest tower is as tall as any cathedral in Europe, and yet the building never overwhelms the visitor. And the final touch of genius, the towers all imitate the shape of the closed-up bud of a lotus flower. And here is the man who built it all, sitting under the 15 parasols that denote a Khmer king, surrounded by his court, his army, and his apsaras, the court dancers. King Suryavarman spent most of his life atop of a war elephant fighting Cambodians' traditional enemy, the Vietnamese. But from the loot gained from these wars, he created a masterpiece. For many, Angkor Wat is simply the finest ancient building ever created. But Angkor Wat, astonishing though it is, isn't the only great Khmer temple. The empire that produced Angkor Wat was about to produce a king who would eclipse even this glory. And we know what he looks like. This is the famous statue of Jayavarman VII, being carefully restored in the National Museum of Cambodia. It's a portrait of a devout Buddhist deep in meditation. His head gives an instant impression of power, with hair so closely cropped that the shape of the skull is revealed. The eyes remain closed, serene, meditative, and the mysteriously smiling lips convey a sense of spiritual peace. Yet the firm, square jaw is the mark of a man of iron will. The greatest king the Khmer ever produced, the Napoleon of Angkor. And he needed to be a fighter. Only a few years earlier, the Vietnamese attacked and looted Angkor. But Jayavarman got his revenge, and in a great battle on the Tonle Sap Lake, he defeated his enemies. These are Cham soldiers from what is today southern Vietnam in their distinctive helmets resembling an upside-down lotus. As losers, they are being eaten alive by crocodiles. To prevent any future Vietnamese invasion, Jayavarman fortified his capital with immense walls and filled the moat with crocodiles. Within the walls, in what is now tropical jungle, was once a thriving city of over 1 million people. This at a time when London had fewer than 30,000. And at each of the city's 5 gates, he built soaring towers with their great entranceways of gods and demons wrestling with sacred snakes. And on each tower, a vast enigmatic face with the famous smile of Angkor. Archaeologists debated for decades whose face it is. It is now generally agreed that the face is a composite of Jayavarman's own face and the compassionate face of the Buddha. Right at the center of his city of Angkor Thom, the greatest of all Khmer kings, Jayavarman VII, built his temple mountain, the strangest of them all. Look closely at its 54 towers. Staring down at you are 216 large faces carved in stone, all Jayavarman. The faces with slightly curving lips, eyes placed in shadow by lowered lids, utter not a word, and yet force you to guess much, wrote a visitor here in the 1920s. Around the time the Magna Carta was being signed in an English meadow, Khmer sculptors were carving these heads, some of the greatest works of art ever created. A century ago, a French visitor wrote, "I shudder suddenly with an indefinable fear as I perceive falling upon me from above a huge fixed smile, and then another smile again, beyond, on another stretch of wall, and then 3, and then 5, and then 10. They appear everywhere, and I realize that I have been overlooked from all sides by the faces of the quadruply faced towers." The heads, with their friendly yet ironic smiles, make the Bayon Temple an extraordinary building to ponder in the daylight. But at night, under a full moon, it becomes a temple from another world, built by aliens, whose ideas and conceptions are entirely unfamiliar and strange to the 20th century. The Bayon Temple is also a window into the past. Its carved stone walls are the key to the life of a lost civilization. Here a woman gives birth, a fire is blown alight, a pig is cooked, lice removed from a friend's hair. Just after these murals were finished, a Chinese visitor to Angkor was making his way through the Tonle Sap, through the sunken forest, to spend nearly a year at the Cambodian capital. His name was Chu Ta Quan, the year 1296, and by great luck, he kept a diary that has survived. From the diary, we can tell that the houses of ordinary folk were on stilts, very similar to houses in the Cambodian countryside today. We know that ordinary people had palm leaf roofs. Tiles were forbidden to them. They cooked outside, and inside their houses, they had no tables, benches, basins, or buckets. Evil spirits were so prevalent in everyday life that parents would never give a beautiful name to their children. On the contrary, they would call them bracelet, cooking pot, or even dog or pig to discourage and disgust ill-disposed spirits. And what's so amazing is how little has changed since he described the everyday life of 800 years ago. Thanks to Chu's diary, we know what happened here when you tried to enter Angkor. Guards were placed at each of the city's 5 gates to closely examine the feet of those wishing to enter the city. Why? Well, criminals had their toes chopped off. So, no toes, no entry. Chu had all his toes, but he was not allowed to enter the inner palace. That was reserved for the concubines and an army of 2,000 female servants. He was told, however, how the king spent his night. By the palace rises a golden tower, which the ruler climbs every night to sleep. It is a common belief that in the tower dwells a genie, formed like a serpent with 7 heads, which is the lord of the entire kingdom. Every night the snake appears in the shape of a woman with whom the king is forced to make love. Should he fail for just 1 night to copulate with the snake, it is a sign that the king's death is at hand. He also had a strange tale to tell about these towers, still standing 800 years after he wrote about them. If 2 men are in a dispute about something, they are both imprisoned in one of the towers for several days. When allowed to emerge, one of them will be found to be suffering some illness, ulcers, swollen glands, or fever. The other man will be in perfect health. Thus is right and wrong determined by what is called a celestial judgment. Everyone I talked to said that Cambodian women are highly sexed, wrote the Chinese visitor in his diary. It wasn't only their sexual freedom that shocked the conservative Chu. He was also amazed at the amount of political and commercial freedoms women had in ancient Angkor. The wife of Jayavarman VII was responsible for founding over 102 hospitals, like a modern-day First Lady might do. Chu also refers to the ancient practice of using sorcerers to heal the sick, probably referring to a ritual still practiced in the Cambodian countryside to this day. The healer dances herself into a trance and then changes into the clothes of the spirit whose help she is trying to invoke. Once transformed into the grandfather spirit, the healing process can commence. It may take several sessions for the cure to work, but mediums like this have a high success rate and a long list of patients awaiting cures. Chu is the only witness we have to this vanished age. No other written record of everyday life has survived, and from his diaries, we can glimpse the magnificence of ancient Angkor. But by Chu's time, it was a culture facing catastrophe. After 500 years, the glory of Angkor came to an end. The collapse of these stunning temples in Cambodia was caused by the Mongol hordes. Their military success pushed the Thais south into Khmer territory. Once the Thais had been portrayed on the walls of Angkor Wat as allies of the Khmer, their soldiers parading in long pleated skirts and braided hair. Now they became the final threat. After a siege of 7 months, the city fell, and the days of glory were finally over. After this siege, the Thai victors carried off the entire dance corps of the city, which is where one can trace the beginnings of classical Thai dance. As northerners, they wore thicker court dress than the more tropical Khmers. That's why today both Thai and Cambodian dancers wear the court dress of Thailand rather than that of the Khmers, whose topless dancers are represented in thousands of carvings and statues. After the siege, the tropical jungle crept back over the statues and shrines. Trees put their roots down into the cracks between stones. And as the centuries passed, the roots became vast, pushing aside great blocks of stone as though they were weightless. It has been said temples were held in a stranglehold of trees. Stone and wood clasp each other in grim hospitality. Yet, all is silent and still, without any visible movement to indicate their struggle, as if they were wrestlers suddenly petrified, struck motionless in the middle of a fight. But the rounds in this battle were not measured by minutes, but by centuries. Eventually, Cambodia threw off its Thai invaders, but the final fatal blow to Angkor was dealt by a different kind of enemy: religion. In a land exhausted by war and overambitious building programs, the people were ready for a new message. And it came in a new, kinder form of Buddhism. These new priests didn't require great temples to be built, and shared the poverty of the Cambodian peasant. Just as the new Christian cult of simplicity undermined Roman imperial glory, so the new Theravada school of Buddhism offered a gentle religion of resignation, well suited to an exhausted and discouraged people. They were only too happy to see the old temples left to nature. Sleeping jewels in the jungle. The person most responsible for bringing these temples to world attention was the Frenchman Henri Mouot. A brilliant amateur artist, his lively and accurate drawings of his 1860 expedition brought the scholarly world's attention to focus on the temples of Angkor. In his footsteps came several other explorers, and their descriptions of these lost jewels in the jungle revealed Angkor to the world. These are the ruins as the first explorers found them. An immense amount of work needed to be done. The jungle had had some 500 years to do its work, and clearing it was a slow and painful process. The French, who now dominated all Southeast Asia, put their archaeological resources into restoring the smothered temples. Struggling against malaria and wild tigers, it took the French school of the Far East years to clear the dense vegetation. But in 1923, a new danger emerged from an unexpected source. The more Angkor was publicized, the more desired its art became, and museums and private dealers vied for better pieces. Looters began hacking the temples to bits, but protecting the remote sites was a problem. The Bante Shrai temple wasn't even discovered until 1914. Its discovery gave a young Frenchman the idea to make some quick money. His name was André Malraux, later to become France's most famous minister of culture. He was considered to be one of Europe's greatest promoters of arts and culture, and when he died, he was buried as a hero. But in 1923, that was a long way ahead, and young Malraux was broke. The temple was a jungle-covered ruin in those days, but Malraux noticed that if he broke off these corner blocks, he would have 2 statues for the price of 1. Using, as he later wrote, saws and chisels on any blocks that remained wedged in the walls, Malraux hacked out the corner blocks as well as several roof ornaments from the upper stories. Then he loaded all the blocks onto ox carts for the journey back to civilization. Luckily for the temple, Malraux was caught and the blocks returned to their rightful place. Malraux himself was tried and convicted, and the incident led to a general tightening of the laws to protect the temples from future thieves. Armed with these new laws and larger budgets, the French school of the Far East pressed ahead. The site was cleared, revealed once again in all its splendid strangeness. Some temples were so completely restored, you might think their original occupants had only just left. But some temples were left largely untouched, so that the visitors could experience the thrill of jungle-covered ruins, just like the first explorers to the area. Their most ambitious project was the restoration of the Baphuan, a typical pyramid temple whose foundations were very unstable. The only way to save the temple was to dismantle all the outer stones, lay them around the temple, and put it all back together again like a giant jigsaw puzzle. They got to the stage where all the outer stones, some 500,000 of them, were laid out around the base of the mound, when a catastrophe beyond human comprehension destroyed all their plans. All that is left of the great civilization of the Khmer are their mysterious jungle-shrouded temples. In the 20th century, the French labored for years restoring these jewels in the jungle. Then, in 1975, Cambodia's Holocaust had arrived in the shape of Pol Pot and his victorious soldiers. A disaster for both people and monuments. All foreigners were expelled. All work at Angkor ceased. Working for the French was an automatic death sentence. And of the 1,000 Cambodians who had worked at conserving the temples, only 2 were alive when Pol Pot's reign of terror came to an end. Most victims were first tortured near here, and their bodies scattered on the outer fringe of the Angkor conservation area. This memorial stands as testimony to their fate. And a Buddhist monastery has been built over their bones. Day and night, the monks pray for the souls of the men, women, and children who fell foul of one of the 20th century's worst crimes. After the Vietnamese deposed Pol Pot, civil war prevented anyone from returning to Angkor for many years. And when they did, they faced a very 20th century problem. Mines, tens of thousands of them, planted by all sides in the Cambodian conflict, and few if any maps as to where they were planted. The cost to Cambodia was hundreds of casualties every week, as people tried to rebuild their lives after the killing fields. But slowly and surely, thanks to the work of groups like Princess Diana's Halo Trust, demining teams are getting on top of the problem. Once they had to work in the very ruins of Angkor. Now, having cleared that, they've moved on to new areas. Carefully probing every inch of earth, an ancient village is searched and cleared of mines. So quick to plant, so slow and dangerous to remove. But once found, Another mine joins the many tens of thousands already destroyed. When the French returned to restoring the Baphuon, they were faced with every archaeologist's worst nightmare. Pol Pot's army had destroyed every single bit of paper in their archaeological headquarters. They had 500,000 individual stones lying around the mound, and no record of where any of them fitted. It took them 2 solid years to work out the world's largest jigsaw puzzle. First, they had to clear the area of landmines, then cut down the jungle to get at the stones, and then make a drawing of each individual stone. Then, using computers, they matched each stone to its neighbor and to its original place on the pyramid. Then, and only then, they could carry on the reconstruction, putting a concrete belt in the pyramid to prevent future slippage, and then carefully replacing each stone. Eventually, 40 years from the day they started, they will have brought the Baphuon back to its original glory. Just a few miles away at Phra Khan, a temple being restored by the World Monument Fund, faces a different set of problems. Phra Khan was a large monastery, one of the many buildings put up by Jayavarman. When Angkor was abandoned, it was left to the jungle. In recent years, it was decided to leave some of the jungle in place to retain some of the magic of its deep tropical setting. But the World Monument Fund's teams are now faced with difficult choices. How much jungle do you allow to grow, and how much do you chop down to provide access for visitors and save buildings from being strangled and broken by the trees? You obviously repair buildings that might fall down and injure someone, but how much do you rebuild? The solution at Phra Khan is to treat the site as a partial ruin. A local team of Cambodian archaeologists and technicians have been trained to repair buildings that are in danger of collapse. But using only a minimum of concrete and high-tech solutions. New trees are prevented from growing up through the ruins. Trees in danger of collapse and damaging the ruins are chopped down, but old, well-established ones are left alone. A delightful balance of nature and ruin. But the dangers of the future are all too clear at Phra Khan. Collectors are hungry for the newly fashionable and expensive Khmer art. During Cambodia's recent political troubles, many statues were crudely attacked in an attempt to steal their heads for foreign collectors. Here, looters started their work, but were interrupted, and the statue saved. For the moment. The Angkor sites are many and cover vast areas, and they now face a new threat. Their very popularity. As Cambodians put their nightmare years behind them, more and more tourists, both foreign and Cambodian, are flooding in, carving their initials over some of the greatest art ever created, wearing away staircases walked by priests of long ago, and leaving reminders of an all too modern world. It is crucial that these problems are solved quickly before the magic of Angkor is lost. Search among the ruins, but you will find no lost science, no undiscovered ethics. Unlike China, the elusive Khmers left us no record of their administrative genius. Unlike India, no philosophy or religion. But here at Angkor, art and architecture reached their finest expression. That all came to an end 5.5 centuries ago when Angkor fell. But there is one fragile link back to this culture that time forgot. This little girl is going to be the greatest dancer of her generation, just like her mother. Her mother's career ended when Pol Pot tried to destroy all traditional culture, and she was forced to work in the rice fields. If her guards had known of her past, it would have meant instant execution. But she survived, and the skills she learned from an earlier generation survived as well. Now her only daughter can pass on the wisdom. The Angkor ruins have survived as well, despite Pol Pot, and despite the theft of its statues, despite the tourists and the tropical climate. It is still the most beautiful and most exotic ancient site in the world. As one of its first visitors wrote, "Go to Angkor, my friend, to its ruins and to its dreams."